Central America finds itself, well, really at a critical point, doesn't it? It's facing this increasing battering from extreme weather, stronger hurricanes, more intense droughts. And this isn't some far-off threat. It's the reality for millions right now.
Absolutely. And that urgency, that very real need for solutions is why we're diving into this fascinating study today.
Exactly. So the research we're unpacking today is titled Enabling Central America's Energy Transition Through Renewable Energy, Energy Citizenship, and Regional Integration. Quite a title.
It is, and it tackles a huge question. How can these 7 Central American nations, that's Guatemala, Belize, El Salvador, Honduras, Nicaragua, Costa Rica, and Panama, how can they actually achieve a complete 100% renewable energy system by 2050?
100% renewable by 2050.
Yeah.
For the entire region. I mean, that's incredibly ambitious. But this study, it doesn't just state the goal and leave it there, right?
Yeah.
It actually maps out ways to get there.
Precisely. Yeah, this study, it rigorously looks at 3 different scenarios. You've got the most ambitious one, the best policy scenario, or BPS. That one aims for, well, total defossilization, basically getting rid of fossil fuels entirely.
Okay, the BPS.
Then there's the delayed policy scenario, the DPS. That's a bit more cautious, more gradual. And finally, you have the current policy scenario, CPS, which just projects what happens if we stick with today's policies.
Right. So best case, a slower path, and kind of a business as usual. Now, something that really jumped out at me was the study's use of country-specific costs. Why is that important?
Yeah, that's a really insightful part of the study. Instead of just using a generic cost for investments across the board, it brings in the country-specific weighted average cost of capital, the WACC.
WACC, right?
Think of WACC as how risky investors see putting money into a particular country. By using these specific rates for each nation, the study gives us a much more, realistic picture of how and where renewable projects might actually happen.
Oh.
Because attracting investment in Costa Rica, say, might look very different financially than in Honduras or Nicaragua. It reflects that reality.
That makes total sense. It adds that layer of kind of on-the-ground financial reality.
Hmm.
So, given this detailed framework, what's our main goal here today? Diving into enabling Central America's energy transition through renewable energy, energy citizenship, and regional integration.
Well, our mission really is to pull out the key insights from this research. We want to get beyond just the numbers and really understand, is this transition feasible for Central America? What are the big challenges? And crucially, what are the potential benefits? We're looking for those aha moments, you could say.
Got it. Okay, let's get into specifics then. This study kicks off by painting a pretty stark picture of the climate vulnerabilities Central America is already dealing with. It's not just future stuff, is it?
No, not at all. This study really hammers home the immediate threats. We're seeing quite clearly more devastating extreme weather, and alongside that, there's this critical problem of less rainfall, which, as the study points out, directly hits the region's farming, their livestock, and even their hydropower capacity.
Right, hydropower, a major renewable source that's becoming vulnerable itself because of climate change.
Yeah.
That's quite the paradox.
It really is. And the fallout goes way beyond just environmental damage. This study connects these climate issues directly to the existing socioeconomic inequalities in the region.
How so?
Well, think about it. Smaller harvests, less water, that makes food insecurity worse. It pushes people to move, migration, and it causes real economic losses. It's like a feedback loop where climate change just makes existing problems even harder.
It's a powerful point. Climate action isn't just environmental policy. It's social policy, economic policy. It's all linked. Now, this study also looks back a bit at how the energy systems there evolved, what shaped the current situation.
Yeah, it looks back to the 90s. There was this big push for energy reforms, mostly privatization. But a few things happened. Oil prices were relatively low then. Sometimes the regulations favored short-term thinking, maybe not enough long-term focus on sustainability. And the result was that most countries, Costa Rica was kind of the exception, actually became more reliant on oil for generating electricity. Then, when oil prices shot up in the early 2000s, that really exposed how vulnerable they'd become.
Interesting. So privatization didn't automatically mean a cleaner or more secure system. In some cases, it led to more dependence on imported fuel.
Exactly. But it's also important to say the study highlights real progress more recently, too. There's definitely been a shift towards adopting renewables and the development of the regional electricity market, MER.
MER.
And that interconnected transmission line, SIPAC. Those are really vital steps towards integrating the region's energy system. For listeners, MR lets these countries trade electricity, and SIPAC is the physical power line connecting them.
That regional grid sounds critical.
Mhm.
But even with that progress, this study says there are still big challenges. What are they?
Well, even with more renewable power being generated, energy poverty is still a really big issue for many people. And there's still this heavy reliance on imported fossil fuels, especially for transport.
So cars, trucks.
Exactly. It points to, low levels of electrification in key areas and lots of people still lacking access to modern energy.
So a mixed picture, progress, but still major hurdles. On the upside, though, this study does look at the sheer potential for renewables in Central America.
Yes, it does. And the numbers are pretty impressive. The estimated maximum potential looking at solar PV, concentrated solar, wind, hydro, geothermal, it massively exceeds the region's total energy demand back in 2019.
Wow.
So the basic message is the natural resources, they're definitely there in abundance.
Okay, the potential exists. Now let's get back to those scenarios,
Okay.
BPS, DPS, and CPS. Can you walk us through the main assumptions behind each pathway in this study, enabling Central America's energy transition through renewable energy, energy citizenship, and regional integration?
Sure. Let's start with the best policy scenario, BPS. That's the fast track, aiming for 100% renewables by 2050. A key rule here is no new fossil fuel power or heat plants after 2020. There are some initial exceptions for gas turbines, partly because they're cleaner than coal or oil, and potentially could use sustainable fuels later.
Stop building fossil fuel plants. What else?
The BPS also assumes some gradual limits on how quickly renewable capacity can grow each year just to keep the transition manageable. It sets limits on how much power can come from prosumers, homes or businesses with their own solar panels.
Right.
It projects an increasing use of synthetic fuels called Fischer-Tropsch fuels for transport. And importantly, it includes a rising cost for carbon emissions.
The carbon price, okay.
And one more thing within the BPS, this study actually looks at variations. Like, what if geothermal energy is harder to develop than expected? Or what if the countries don't interconnect their grids as much?
Got it. So BPS is full speed ahead, various checks and balances, and exploring some what-ifs. How does the delayed policy scenario, DPS, compare?
DPS is, well, delayed. It allows new fossil fuel plants to be built. It assumes renewables grow more slowly. It sets limits on reducing fossil fuels in transport, but they're less strict. Prosumer generation is lower, and the carbon cost is lower, too. It's still moving towards renewables, just slower.
More gradual. And the current policy scenario, CPS, business as usual.
Pretty much. CPS takes the current policies based on what the Latin American Energy Organization, OLE, projects. So new fossil fuel plants are allowed. Renewable growth follows OLEV's current forecasts. Transport keeps using a lot of fossil fuels, very little prosumer generation, and importantly, no carbon cost at all.
Okay, so a clear spectrum. Rapid change, gradual change, or current trajectory. How does this affect the overall energy demand projected in the region?
Well, the demand levels vary. What's really interesting is that the ambitious scenarios, BPS especially, see a big increase in electrification. More electricity used for transport, for heating.
Right, electric vehicles, heat pumps.
Exactly. So by 2050 in the BPS, the study estimates final energy demand is roughly 21% for power itself, 35% for heat, and 44% for transport. The CPS, with less electrification, has a different split and generally higher overall demand because it's still using less efficient fossil fuel tech.
So electrification is a major lever in the scenarios that really cut emissions deep.
That's a key insight, yeah. Pushing electrification in transport and heat is crucial for decarbonization.
And what does this mean for the share of renewable energy in the total mix across these scenarios in this study? Enabling Central America's energy transition through renewable energy, energy citizenship, and regional integration.
This is where you see the really dramatic differences. The BPS shows this sharp ramp up in renewables, especially after 2025, hitting that 100% renewable primary energy supply by 2050.
100%.
The DPS also makes big strides, getting to about 93% renewables by 2050.
Yeah.
But there's still that fossil fuel chunk left, mainly in transport. And the CPS, much, much slower, only reaches about 45% renewables by 2050. So the takeaway is stark. Proactive policy is what makes the difference. It's the driver for accelerating the shift.
That really underscores the impact of the choices made now. Okay, let's zoom in on electricity generation. How does that sector change?
Well, as you'd expect, both DPS and BPS project a massive expansion in renewable installed capacity by 2050. A key trend this study points out is a really significant shift towards solar PV and actually away from relying so heavily on hydropower.
Because of the climate vulnerability we talked about. droughts.
Exactly. Hydropower is becoming less reliable. So by 2050, the DPS sees around 98 gigawatts of solar PV installed. The BPS scenarios project even more, somewhere between 115 and 203 gigawatts.
That is a huge amount of solar. What does that mean for where the actual electricity comes from, the generation mix?
Under BPS and DPS, solar PV and geothermal power just completely dominate the mix. Solar PV is projected to generate somewhere between, say, 74% and 90% of all electricity in the BPS variations by 2050.
Wow, up to 90% solar.
Yeah. And geothermal adds another maybe 7% to 14%, providing that stable baseload power. The CPS, meanwhile, keeps a much more mixed bag with a lot of fossil fuels still hanging around.
So the study's vision is clearly solar as the workhorse, backed up by geothermal.
That's the core projection for a renewable Central America, yes.
But solar is variable, right?
Yeah.
So sun doesn't shine at night. What role does energy storage play here?
Storage. It becomes absolutely vital, both electrical storage, batteries, and potentially gas storage like hydrogen. It's critical for balancing out renewables like solar. And the need gets even bigger in those scenarios where, if, say, geothermal development hits roadblocks or if the regional grid connections aren't strong.
How much storage are we talking?
This study estimates that in those more constrained scenarios, you could need electrical storage capacity somewhere in the range of 137 to 208 gigawatt hours by 2050. That's substantial.
A huge battery, basically.
Yeah.
How does connecting the country's grids more effectively change that picture?
That's a really crucial finding in this study. Stronger regional electricity exchange countries trading power easily, demonstrably cuts down the need for storage. It also reduces curtailment.
Curtailment, that's when you have to waste renewable energy.
Exactly. Too much sun or wind, nowhere for the power to go. So the BPS scenario that assumes strong interconnection and lots of geothermal shows way less curtailment compared to scenarios without those things.
But you need the infrastructure for that exchange.
Absolutely. The existing SciPac line would need a major upgrade, potentially reaching around 22 gigawatts of transmission capacity by 2050 to handle that level of exchange.
So the key insight is?
The key insight is that a connected regional grid almost acts like a giant shared battery. It lets countries balance out their renewables across the whole region much more efficiently.
It sounds like regional cooperation isn't just nice to have, it's fundamental for making this work cost-effectively. Did this study show which countries might trade the most?
It does. The BPS scenario with strong integration projects the biggest power flows in 2050 between Guatemala and Honduras and also between Costa Rica and Panama. We're talking about 15 and 12 terawatt hours, respectively. It shows how they can leverage each other's strengths.
Fascinating. Okay, so beyond electricity, this study, enabling Central America's energy transition through renewable energy, energy citizenship, and regional integration, looks at other sectors too, like heat and transport. It mentions sector coupling. What's that about?
Sector coupling is basically about linking these traditionally separate energy sectors, power, heat, transport together. The goal is to use renewable energy more effectively across the board. It happens through direct electrification and indirect electrification.
Okay, direct electrification first.
Right. So for heating, this study sees a big shift to using electric boilers and heat pumps directly powered by renewable electricity. You'd also use thermal energy storage like hot water tanks to help manage supply and demand. So less burning gas or oil for heat, more using clean electricity.
Makes sense. Powering heat with clean electrons.
Yeah.
But what about the tricky sectors, like heavy trucks or maybe certain industries, things that are hard to just plug in?
That's where indirect electrification comes in, using what are called power-to-X or PTX technologies.
Power-to-X?
Yeah. You use renewable electricity to create energy carriers. The main one is hydrogen, green hydrogen, made through electrolysis. You can also make things like e-methane. Essentially, you're turning clean electricity into green fuels.
Okay, green fuels.
These fuels can then be used in those hard-to-electrify sectors. This study even looks at how much the electrolyzers, the machines that make hydrogen, might run in different BPS scenarios. They could soak up a lot of excess renewable power when generation is high.
And this study highlights these green fuels, e-hydrogen, those Fischer-Tropsch fuels, as essential for getting transport completely off fossil fuels by 2050 in the BPS and DPS. That must take a lot of electricity, right?
Oh, absolutely. A huge amount. This study projects the renewable electricity needed just for making these sustainable fuels could top 250 terawatt hours by 2050 in the BPS. It really shows how interconnected everything becomes in a fully renewable system. The key point is you don't just need clean power generation. You need ways to convert and use that clean power in different forms across the whole economy.
It's a picture of a radically different energy system, way more integrated, all running on clean power.
Okay, let's shift to the outcomes. What are the economic and environmental results of these different paths laid out in this study? Enabling Central America's energy transition through renewable energy, energy citizenship, and regional integration.
Well, environmentally, the contrast is night and day. This study projects CO2 emissions plummeting in all the best policy scenarios, hitting net zero by 2050.
Net zero.
The delayed policy scenario, DPS, also shows big cuts but slower. The current policy scenario, emissions just keep going up, period.
Yeah.
And notably, the BPS aims to get the power sector totally decarbonized by 2030. The DPS doesn't manage that until 2045. So the environmental message is clear. Only the kind of aggressive action in the BPS gets Central America on track for climate goals. Zero emissions by 2050? That's huge. But the economics, that kind of transition must cost a lot up front.
It definitely requires major investment. This study estimates the total cumulative investment under BPS is somewhere between 125 and 140 billion euros.
Billion, will it be?
Yes. And the peak spending years are projected around 2040, mostly driven by building out those PGX facilities, the electrolyzers, the synthetic fuel plants for transport.
That's a big number. But does this study suggest it pays off in the long run?
Exactly. That's a really crucial finding here. Despite that big upfront cost, the annual costs of running the energy system are projected to drop significantly by 2050 in the BPS.
How?
Mainly because you eliminate fossil fuel costs. You're not importing oil and gas anymore. For example, the BPS scenario with strong regional links sees annual system costs drop by 35% from the 2020-2040 average, down to about 13 billion euros in 2050.
So the key economic insight is invest now, save later.
Pretty much. The long-term savings from cutting fuel imports and lower operating costs make the renewable transition look economically very attractive.
What about the cost of energy for actual consumers? Electricity bills, fuel costs.
Also projected to come down significantly in the BPS compared to the CPS. The study looks at the levelized cost of electricity, LCOE, basically the lifetime cost of generating power.
Right.
In the BPS, the LCOE is projected around 20 to 21 euros per megawatt hour in 2050. It's slightly higher, maybe 23 euros if regional connections aren't as strong.
That sounds quite low.
It is. And while there's some variation between countries, Belize and Panama might be slightly higher in one scenario, El Salvador, potentially the lowest, the overall trend is clear. The BPS leads to average reductions of about 65% in the cost of electricity and 39% in the overall cost of final energy by 2050, compared to sticking with current policies.
So cleaner energy is actually cheaper energy in the long run. That's a powerful message.
It really is. The takeaway is that this transition isn't just good for the planet, it promises more affordable energy too.
Okay, so what are the main things driving this transition in the best policy scenario, according to this study? Enabling Central America's energy transition through renewable energy, energy citizenship, and regional integration. What makes it work?
The study points to several key drivers working together. First, it's about diversifying the energy mix, really leaning into those abundant solar and geothermal resources. Second, the role of prosumers, people generating their own power, is important. Third, that reliable geothermal power provides crucial stability to balance out the solar. Fourth, energy storage, obviously. Fifth, that sector coupling we talked about, linking power, heat, and transport. And finally, as we've stressed, strong regional electricity trading is vital.
It's like a whole system working together, technology, policy, cooperation. Speaking of policy, what are the main recommendations coming out of this research?
This study lays out 5 key policy recommendations. First, governments need policies that really push large-scale renewable deployment and diversification. It highlights Panama's use of auctions as a good example of driving down costs.
Auctions, okay.
Second, strategies to mitigate market and policy risks are crucial for lowering that WACC, that cost of capital. Things like renewable portfolio standards, feed-in tariffs, tax breaks, getting rid of fossil fuel subsidies, making it less risky to invest in renewables.
Makes sense. Create a stable playing field. What else?
Third, because you need to decarbonize everything, policies specifically promoting sector coupling and those powered X technologies are needed, supporting EVs, electrolyzers, heat pumps.
Right.
Fourth, dedicated policies to empower people and communities, supporting e-mobility, making it easier to install rooftop solar, enabling demand response programs where people can adjust their energy use.
Getting citizens involved.
Exactly. And fifth, Policies that actively foster deeper regional cooperation, expanding the grid connections, coordinating planning, tapping into the best resources across the whole region.
Hmm.
The study really emphasizes the huge technical and financial upsides of doing that.
So it's a really comprehensive policy package needed, covering supply, demand, technology, finance, individuals, and regional teamwork. Does this study mention broader socioeconomic benefits too?
Yes, definitely. The potential positives are significant. This study anticipates less energy poverty because energy should become cheaper and prices more stable. Better energy security, less reliance on volatile global fuel markets. It could make other economic sectors more competitive and, importantly, create jobs.
Jobs in.
In developing and building renewable projects, manufacturing components, installation, maintenance, producing those sustainable fuels, a whole range of areas.
It really paints this transition as potentially transformative for Central America, environmentally, economically, socially. Now, no study is perfect. What limitations does this research acknowledge?
Yeah, the authors are upfront about areas for future work. The way they estimate the WACC, the cost of capital, could potentially be refined further.
Right.
All scenario analysis involves uncertainties about the future, of course. The study relies on projected cost drops for things like solar panels and batteries, which seem likely but aren't guaranteed. And finally, while it looks across sectors, they suggest more detailed studies focused specifically on industry or agriculture or water desalination would be valuable for getting a more granular picture.
Good to know. It shows where research can go next. So let's wrap up our deep dive. What's the absolute core message from this study? Enabling Central America's energy transition through renewable energy, energy citizenship, and regional integration.
I think the central conclusion is incredibly clear and actually quite optimistic. It finds that a transition to a 100% renewable energy system by 2050 isn't just technically possible or economically feasible for Central America, it actually offers massive long-term benefits.
Benefits
Like significant cost savings on energy, the vital environmental outcome of hitting zero CO2 emissions, and a whole host of positive socioeconomic spin-offs for the region.
And this study is clear that making this ambitious goal a reality really depends on a few critical elements.
Absolutely. You need those supportive, well-designed policies creating a stable market for renewables. That's non-negotiable. You need strong, sustained regional cooperation working together across borders. And crucially, you need the active involvement of citizens. That energy citizenship the study talks about people participating, adopting technologies, supporting the shift.
It's a compelling vision, a pathway for Central America towards a cleaner, more secure, more affordable energy future. And it really makes you think, doesn't it? Could this kind of ambitious, detailed plan be a model, or at least an inspiration, for other regions facing similar climate and development challenges? And what does that energy citizenship really mean for you, for me, for communities everywhere? How do we all become active players in shaping our energy future? Definitely something to ponder. And if you want to explore all the details yourself, do check out the full study, Enabling Central America's Energy Transition Through Renewable Energy, Energy Citizenship, and Regional Integration.